Now, you did also mention free will.
Yes.
My kind of understanding of free will is I've read Sam Harris's essay on free will. I've listened to a few of people that have been on Lex Friedman's podcast to speak about free will being this illusion. And if I'm honest, I'm pretty sad about it, because it's a lot to take on, that you might not have the agency that you think you do.
Mm-hmm.
But in your book, you spoke about free will in a way that kind of put me at ease a bit, which honestly I can't thank you enough for, because that's been a long time coming. But you speak about spooky free will, and there was another type of free will that you spoke about.
Yeah, I'm glad you found it reassuring. I've actually found it quite reassuring too, I must admit, coming to this particular view. It's not totally different from people like Sam Harris, but I think it's not entirely the same. So there are two keys. The first key is to distinguish spooky free will, as you mentioned, from other kinds of free will.
Yeah.
So when people say free will doesn't exist or free will is an illusion, what kind of free will are they talking about? So there's this idea that for free will to be meaningful, it has to be this kind of mental force that's coming from the essence of you or me, like coming from this idea of a self that we've just established that doesn't exist anyway. Yeah, exactly. That's pulling strings inside the body or inside the brain and making stuff happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, like intervening into the causal fabric of the universe to change the outcome.
Yeah.
This is asking a lot. I mean, this is not asking for some sort of complicated biological phenomenon. This is asking to change the laws of physics.
Yeah.
To have something that can pop in and alter the flow of physical events. And this is just not happening, and also not the kind of free will that we should want to preserve, that we should want to have. I mean, there's a whole argument in the philosophy of free will where people say, well, if the universe is deterministic, which means that every state is predetermined by what happened before, then there can be no room for free will.
Yeah.
But the only kind of free will there's no room for is this spooky one that comes in and changes stuff around.
Okay.
Now, we don't have that. I believe we don't have that kind of free will. I don't believe that's a possible kind of free will to have.
No.
But I don't think we lose anything by ruling that out.
No.
Now so what's left? If we rule that out, do we have to be sad, or can we still be comfortable with our roles in the world? So we all experience free will. Like I just can decide to pick up this and have a bit more coffee now.
Yeah.
Or just put it down on the table. It felt like a voluntary action. Nobody forced me to do it. I felt like doing it. I did it. So there's this experience. But what actually is going on there? Was there this essence of me that parachuted into the brain and pulled some strings? No. It's simply that we're all very complicated organisms.
Yeah.
And we do things. And sometimes the things we do have causes that go back further within our own brains and bodies and don't immediately come from the world. Like if I put my hand on a typical example, I put my hand on a hot stove and I remove my hand before I even realize it. That didn't feel like a voluntary action because the cause was right there in the world. Somebody kicks me in the shin, same thing.
Yeah.
But if I sort of swing my leg to kick a football or pick up this cup, feels like a voluntary action.
Yeah.
The causes have come from within. So this is the kind of free will that we do have. Some actions that we make are deeply rooted in our history of who we are. And we experience those particular actions as voluntary. And so I think that's kind of all the free will that we need. We do things that come largely from within. If we think about what an experience of free will is like, it feels like that. There's another aspect which makes it tricky, is that it feels like we could have done otherwise too.
Yes.
That's the other tricky part. That's what makes people cling on to this idea that for free will to make sense, there must have been something that parachuted in and change things.
Yeah.
But that's just part of the experience. So I like to think of experiences of free will a bit like experiences of colour. You know,
Okay.
red, green doesn't exist out there in the world, but it's still a very useful thing for our brains to create. You know, seeing colour is very useful for us because we can tell surfaces under different lighting conditions.
Yeah.
Experiencing free will is very useful for us to do as well, because it labels certain things that we do as coming largely from within,
Yeah.
and then we can learn from them. And we might do differently the next time, because our brains won't be the same the next time.
And should you rewind the clock back on the universe and everything as it was before, you pretty much could never have acted differently, right? Like, it was always going to be the thing that you did. And
Yeah.
I find one of the positive things, and since I started having a look into free will, is that I feel a lot more compassion for people, and particularly myself, which is really handy, because of that understanding that, like, well, everything kind of led me to doing that anyway. And of course, there are going to be people out there who end up doing awful things. And I just don't know whether it should be my compassion should die with me on that hill of, I mean, like, well, that was, they kind of were always going to do that, whatever that negative thing is.
Yes, and there's I think this is let me try and think how to respond to that, but it's basically I agree with you that it can, in the best case, it can foster compassion for others and compassion for the self. It's not so much that you are always going to do X. I mean, there might be randomness in the universe.
Of course.
But the thing is, that randomness is not like a little window for this spooky free will to get in there.
No.
You know, things might turn out differently, but if they do, it won't really have anything to do with your free will. It'll just be because there's randomness.
Okay.
So to the extent that you have control, no, you couldn't have done differently. And if you replay the tape of the universe, you will get the same thing, apart from differences that are just due to randomness.
Yeah.
And so this can, what lesson can you draw from that? Some people, I think, wrongly draw this idea of fatalism. They're like, okay, well then, what's the point of trying to do anything? Like, I'll just sit back and let stuff happen. Of course, that's a decision too. And if you do that, well, you couldn't have done anything else.
Yeah.
But that's not sort of a conclusion that you can draw. No, you just keep on doing what you're doing, and you'll still have the same experiences. But I do think it cultivates a bit more compassion towards those experiences. And actually, to the extremes, it can change the way we might think about law and punishment and retribution. There are already some examples of people whose character changed dramatically.
Yes.
And so there's one example I talk about in the book, a famous example of America's first mass school shooter. Not a happy example, but an engineering student who shot a bunch of people in Texas from the top of a water tower, and he'd left a note, and he'd asked in his suicide note, he was killed at the scene, he asked in his suicide note for his brain to be examined. And it turned out that he had this brain tumour that was pressing down on part of the brain called the amygdala, which is important in fear responses as well.
Yeah.
And if you look at a case like that, it's very hard to say, well, I can't really blame him for what he did. It was the fact that he had a brain tumour, and of course he didn't decide to have this brain tumour.
No.
And if he hadn't have had the brain tumour, we'll never know, but it seems unlikely that he would have gone and committed this terrible crime.
Yeah.
But of course, in a sense, we're all brain tumours all the way down. I mean, none of us chose to have the brains that we have.
No.
So how can we hold people responsible for what they do?
Yeah, of course, because we don't choose what we want. I think that's quite a big point in the world of free will, is that there is no freedom because you don't get to choose your wants. But there's that little bit that gives people hope in between wanting something and doing something. Yeah. And cases like that, there was another case in your book of a school teacher who had a tumour, started to be sexually attracted to children, had the tumour taken out, and was no longer sexually attracted to human, was back to his normal life, and there was no history of that before. And that ties into the self not being this kind of constant thing. And my grandma died of dementia a couple of years ago, and she was her, but not her by the end of it. And that was it's a degenerative brain disease. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So it makes you think about. I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and I think it's one of those things that you kind of have to dip in and out of every now and then to keep thinking about it, because it bears a lot of thinking about. Right?
It does bear a lot of thinking about. I think it does. It does warrant. This is again why people meditate. But you don't have to meditate just to think about it from different perspectives too, and just to remind yourself that the experience of being who you are, it doesn't point to any one essence of you, like in the middle of your brain or up in the sky or wherever it might be.
Yeah.
It is a continually unfolding process, a perception, and what it is to be you will change over time. Sometimes it will change dramatically if you have a brain tumor, if you have neurodegenerative disease. Some people would say after taking psychedelics their experience of self is changed quite rapidly as well. But the harder point to realise is that it's changing all the time anyway. It's just changing so slowly, usually, that we don't really notice the change. We're becoming different people all the time. And we labour under the illusion that these are just sort of variations on a stable, continuously present essence. Now, it doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem like that to me either. I wake up and I still struggle with the same frustrations and regrets and anxieties and stresses and all these sorts of things. But it does help occasionally just to remind myself of the lesson of the neuroscience and the philosophy and the complementary perspectives, that the self is always changing, it is always evolving. And if that's true, then we can be a little bit more compassionate to ourselves, and we can worry a little bit less. This change will happen, and that's fine.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem to stop at really any stage of your life. As long as your brain's ticking, it's making new corrections, and it is technically changing you, right?
It is changing you, yeah. I mean, we're always different people. We'll be different people at the end of this conversation than we were at the beginning of this conversation. Not radically, maybe, who knows? but a little bit, certainly. And just the same way that we'll change how we experience the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it may seem as though it's the same experience all the time, but it's not going to be. It's going to be slightly different every time. And that applies to the self too. And I think that for me, the best way to bring these ideas to mind is to always just remind myself that how things seem is not how they are.
Yeah.
Whether it's an experience of the world around me, or whether it's an experience of the self. We tend to take our experiences literally, but we should be always, I think, cautious of that and try to understand that, no, that's just the brain's interpretation of what's going on, and that that might change, that will change over time, but it's not necessarily reflecting exactly what's going on, whether that's something in the world or something about the self.